Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Johan and together with me is a very, very special guest. It's Spencer Pitts, Chief Technologist at VMware and one of the EUC legends because you've been working with VMware EUC since they started with EUC, right?
So coming up to 12 years in May, in fact.
Wow.
So 2007 I started. So
wow.
I've got
That's
the great
before Preparo.
Before Preparo and before we even had a VDI product as such.
Wow.
So when I first joined VMware, we literally just had ESX and the beginnings of vSphere back in the day and Virtual Center and GSX. We didn't really have VDI.
Wow.
So
cool.
A long time.
So,
I've seen a few things in my time.
Yeah, so I can imagine you've seen tons of different use cases, different challenges you faced at customers because EUC solves challenges.
So I've seen everything from some of our early deployments of VDI in healthcare all the way through to, and I jokingly used to say that graphics was like kryptonite for VDI.
Right.
And yet, if you look at the products today, there isn't pretty much any solution or any kind of use case that we can't do with Horizon or VDI in general. So yeah,
True.
seen all of the things, all the advances, all the things that fixed all those issues, that stopped customers from going there, and to the point now where, coming from one VDI product all the way through to Workspace ONE. So yeah, seen a few things in my time.
Awesome.
And still here.
Yeah. So that's good. So what would you like to share with us today?
So I know we've done some stuff with Brian before. Brian's been on this and talking about the whole Workspace ONE stack, what we've done, a bit of a history lesson. I thought what I'd do is take it more from a personal perspective. Start off with VDI, but touch on some of the things that we've done as decisions around maybe how we deliver images, how we manage physical PCs versus VDI. And so it's kind of touching on some of the things that Brian said, but things like application delivery as well. Why we've gone down certain routes, why we've chosen certain ways of delivering, and how that's affected the overall choice, and I guess bringing it back to the end user, why that's eventually made it such that you potentially go into a customer and they say, well, we only have this, or we've got one way of doing things. So it'd be nice to kind of understand IT, why they've done what they've done, and maybe a little bit of a history of why we got to there, and maybe how we can change things.
Sounds good.
And we might even touch on some stuff that we're looking at internally, potentially, and what the industry is seeing. So yeah, let's give it a go.
Awesome.
So, where should we start? So, I've got a bit of a checkered background as well. So before I joined VMware, I say checkered because that makes it sound like it was dodgy, but before I joined VMware, I used to work at Symantec.
Right.
And I used to look after products like, well, just as Altiris was bought, that's when I left, but I used to look after a product called On Command CCM that became part of the Ghost suite, if you remember Ghost, and all of those products, and backup exec system recovery, which kind of made it into the Ghost personal product now as well. So I've got some history there. And before that, I used to work as part of, I was a sysadmin for Bank of New York. And I was specifically looking after deploying desktops back in the day. So
physical desktops.
Physical desktops. Right. Used to look after about 700, something along those lines. It was a kind of local branch of Bank of New York in the UK. And I could wake up all machines in the middle of the night. This was around about 2000, 2002 area. And I could wake them all up. I could not re-image them. We used to do this unattended build. And deliver the applications, and then if a user phoned up and they had a problem, we could reset the desktop and put it back to as it was. I was kind of proud because I, as an IT guy looking after the desktop estate, I had it massively exactly how I wanted it, right? I was very proud. I could go home on a Friday evening safe in the knowledge that if there was a problem, I could do upgrades over the middle of the weekend. I could get everybody back up and running by Monday morning. I could remotely dial in. I could have my beer on a Friday evening.
Sounds like a sysadmin's dream.
Well, yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it was, right? So I wouldn't have to come in. I could remotely dial in. I could check on the progress of all the builds, and I could pretty much look after the entire desktop state totally remotely, which back in the day was pretty good. So it's interesting.
You were ahead of your time.
I'd say we were, yeah. And actually before that, so I kind of go back even further than that, I used to look after OS2 Warp.
Right.
And Windows 3.1. So as part of the bank, we used to look after, because Windows 3.1 didn't have a network stack.
No.
So
that came later.
That came later with Windows for Workgroups and 3.1.1 and then NT, obviously. And so we kind of built our own network stack in there. And some of those early principles that I learned as part of those days, which was mid-90s, I brought forward into, I guess, 2000s when I was doing all these builds. And then eventually, through to my Symantec career, and all the way through to VMware. Because it's ironic, because when I first joined VMware, I wanted to get away from end-user computing.
Right.
I literally had done 15, 16 years. And the first thing I said was when I joined VMware was, I want to get rid of desktops. I don't want to touch desktops ever again.
Right.
I joined...
Well, that failed.
Well, I got sucked back into the murky world of a desktop on a virtual platform instead. But it was interesting back in the day because there weren't many people that actually understood how to manage desktops in VMware. They were very servers, right? So by its very nature. So when somebody comes along and this word called, or this acronym VDI came out, everybody was looking around, especially in Europe, and they said, who knows desktops? And they kind of looked at me and I was like, yeah, I used to manage desktops. I didn't really want anybody to know about that, but I kind of like servers mostly now. But yeah, I mean, you know, the rest is history, and actually that's why I'm here today, because I did a lot of work back in the day, took some of those traditional thinking around how you manage physical PCs, tried to then put it into the virtual world, and you know, we've got 12 years of history of why things did and didn't work from a physical in VDI world.
Right.
And you know, a lot of that is some of the acquisitions we made, some of the thinking around we do app packaging, how we deploy images, etc. So there's a lot of kind of goodness I learned. I earned my stripes and my grey hair. Yeah. That's the way I look at it. Anyway, yes. So
cool.
Where should we start off then, Johan? So what about how we've done maybe building VDI desktops?
Yeah, definitely.
So let's think about it. So I guess if we look at the VDI, the classic VDI stack, so bearing in mind...
A fun fact is that VMware actually invented the term VDI, right?
Yes. So virtual desktop infrastructure, as it was a term that was invented. It was actually a guy called Spencer Critchlow, so Spencer's watching here now,
right.
Who originally, as a PSO project, so a consultancy-led project, customers came to us. So the story was, and I wasn't there at the time, but the story was that there was an insurance broker who used to send PCs over to, I think it was Southeast Asia somewhere, I think it was somewhere in India, and they didn't really want to carry on doing that. So what they said is, why can't we keep those machines back in the UK, and we'll have these developers, because it was for a development use case, which is interesting because that's not really changed too much. We still have those use cases now, and they didn't really want to ship the physical PCs, and they wanted to keep the data locally in UK offices. So actually one of the primary use cases for VDI back in the day was security. And anyway, so they came to us and said, we've got these physical PCs, we don't want to do physical, we've got ESX, as was, we're running servers, can we run XP? And we sort of looked at them and went, why the hell would you want to do that? That sounds like, you know, and they said, well, let's put it another way, actually we've done it. What we're really struggling with now is getting into this issue where we've got about 200 people, it was either 150, 200, and what's happening now is that randomly they're accessing other people's desktops. So what we really want is some kind of, as you want, broker technology that's going to allow us to say when Spencer logs on, he gets this desktop. So there was a guy, Spencer Critchlow, who created a PSO scripted front-end version of VDI, if you like. Because it's funny now, because I just say there was this guy called Spencer in VMware that invented VDI, and I leave it there. So. Some may say I invented VDI, or some guy called Spencer, but I didn't. So Spencer Critchlow, if you're watching, thanks, man. Anyway, yes. So start off with VDI. So I guess the concept here would be that we kind of still kept our thinking. And when I was doing PC management, it was all about the image. I've got a massive image problem still, but it's still about the image. We've always thought about image. And if you think about the benefits, I talked about security. One of the things with VDI was that from an admin perspective, you could do some clever stuff that was really problematic in the physical world. Yeah. I.e., you could rebuild a desktop pretty quickly. So when I first saw VDI, and I'll be honest with you, when I first came over, I was like, no one's ever going to do this VDI stuff. It's never going to catch on. Because I'd done so many years of physical, and I saw all the challenges. Yeah. And I sort of looked at this VDI thing, and I was like, not sure it's going to work. But I was, as you can imagine now, 12 years down the line, I've been swayed. But a lot of what happened was this whole thinking. So people looked at it and went, right, how do I do physical management? How do I do VDI? And they still liked the fact that you could do imaging really quickly. Yeah. So the very first, if you remember back in the day, there was no VMware Composer. No. We didn't have instant clones. It was just native full clone, if you like, at the ESX level. Import your base image, and then basically clone it. So, of course, the first thing that we had was all those struggles with storage, which, think about all the products that have turned up in the market, all the things that we've done, in fact, some of your books you've written around what we do here. But everything was around the image.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly, at that point, a lot of people used to put all their apps in the base image.
Yeah.
Right? Because the concept was, well, in physical world, you'd want to separate those, and I will get to physical in a minute. But in VDI world, it was kind of like, well, I can rebuild the machine so quickly, I'll put all my apps in the base image. And a classic example of that would be Office. So some people sit on the fence on this one. I always used to put my Office applications in the core image, even on physical.
We do too.
Some people used to, but it's because the way I look at it is everybody used to get Office.
Yeah.
Now, I'll get onto that later on because I'm not necessarily sure that every user needs Office anymore. That's another thing, right? But if you're talking traditional Windows, VDI or physical, most people are going to have Office. It's easier for the IT admin person. And that's the interesting thing about VDIs, because even though it was good for the user, some might say back in the day it wasn't the best experience, but it was really good for the admin, wasn't it? So we started getting into this, let's put all the apps in. Now, interesting at this point, when you started doing it at scale, that's when we started hitting issues. Storage issues, performance issues. And if you think about it, what we ended up doing here is we started creating a way of actually having, I'm going to do a really bad picture here of cloning, and we started getting clever at how we did cloning. So we started saying, well, if you remember when Composer came out, why don't we split things down with the image? Why don't we do some really clever, copy on write type technology and actually just do the delta images or the delta changes between the core image and what you want to do? So we got better at doing that. We didn't fix the I/O issues, but we fixed from a perspective here of how we do the image management.
Yeah, and the link clone was born.
Yeah, and a link clone as you would know it today, and what was View Composer back in the time. We got very good, and what we started doing here is, at some point, we started saying there's going to be a user perspective here. So when I used to do physical apps, I used to say Office goes in the core image, and I'd break it down to user apps, departmental apps, and then I also used to have a layer here, which I've written through there, but it doesn't matter. I used to call it utils, interestingly. And utils for me, because this is how I used to do this on physical, I'd say OS, utilities. Utilities would be things like Acrobat Reader, because everybody has it and it's free, and it seems to change every time I wake up in the morning. And it would also be things like antivirus.
Yeah, things that
WinZip,
need to start up prior to Windows logon.
Yeah, so stuff that everyone's going to get. So I've got no licensing impact. It probably doesn't change. Well, in the case of Acrobat Reader, it does, but it kind of everybody gets the same thing, right?
Yeah.
And I used to separate it out. It's not in the core image, but everyone's going to get it. And most of this stuff, everybody would get.
Yeah.
Until you start getting into this bit. And then some would argue whether all of that goes into the core image. Now, the reason I say this at this point is, we didn't back in the day have a proper way of packaging. So the product I used to work with back in the day created its own packaging technology, snapshotting. It used that for, and it used to actually record when you clicked on an installation. This was before the days of silent installs. Yes, believe it or not, I used to know about that. And what it would do is it would record you actually clicking on the OK button, or whether you clicked on browse and it would say see program files, whatever. And it could record the installation parameters.
Right.
And ironically, then Microsoft came along and said, okay, we're going to create MSIs, which sort of just standardized the whole packaging kind of technology in one fair swoop, which is good because we imported that as well. But the challenge here is we've now got, and if you think about the VDI stack, we've got all these apps and we've got them packaged as a MSI.
Yeah.
So the very first thing that I'd see when I used to speak to customers is they'd have a physical, I'm going to keep that as a, I'm going to call it a management solution, right? And then they'd have their PCs underneath, mostly PCs. But they'd have, as I just said, some kind of image or unattended build, depending on what you call it. They do what I said here. So they had these same stacks, but most of these would all be MSIs. Okay? Now, interestingly, what the first thing we said is go to customers, and it depends who you spoke to, because some of the early VDI guys were also infrastructure guys that looked after the virtual estate, and some of those didn't even talk to these guys.
No.
So this was your typical desktop group, right?
And still we see that exact same situation, because 9 out of 10 times there are different cost centers and completely different teams that manage physical and virtual environments. Yeah,
so just in the same way that I said I was a naysayer, I used to see that in the early days.
Yeah.
That you'd get the people going, these were the virtual infrastructure guys that loved the virtual bit, and they were looking for more workloads that they could virtualize. Because you know what it was like. It was back in the day, there were certain things that you would virtualize. There was this, we used to run around with capacity planner, understanding all the workloads, and then we'd steer clear of anything that had a database in it or something like that, or high end. But there was all these classic use cases. And then in the early days of adoption, it was all about what can we virtualize? And the instant thing that came along was desktops.
Yeah.
So all the VDI guys, or all the as-was virtual guys, would then say, well, it's looking to desktop management. And it's only recently I started seeing some of that desktop workload from a virtual and a physical come together. But interestingly, the same thing that we used to do when we went in there, said, right, okay, so you got a physical PC estate. They go, yes. And there was this big clamour, I don't know if you saw this, where we thought we'd virtualize everything under the sun from a PC. We'd go, right, we're going VDI. You must have seen this.
Yeah.
And everybody tried to get every single desktop into a VDI component. Because the reason why they wanted to do it, they suddenly saw from an admin perspective that there was really good stuff we could do at this level, at the image level and the apps level. And they was like, well, this is really problematic for physical. If I put it into VDI, it makes the IT guy's life good, right? But there was all these challenges at the time, that the protocol wasn't quite as advanced. Things like unified comms were coming along. We talked about storage issues as well. There was capacity issues. Graphics, I mean, that's changed now, but as you know, back in the day, we didn't have any real graphics capability.
No.
So there was this whole, we want to get everybody across, but then we started seeing reasons why you couldn't use VDI. So I started building up this list of stuff that wasn't a good candidate back in the day. But the reason we did it, quite simply, and I would have done the same thing, is if I get all of this stuff over to VDI, then as an admin guy, I've got one thing to look after. And I think as an industry, we've been really, really guilty, shall I say, of trying to get to this nirvana of a single image, a single application delivery mechanism, a single management plane, if you like. But we've been guilty of saying, well, we haven't got a unified management plane, so what we're going to do is take everything we did before and move it over. And I think history tells us that what we've ended up doing is we've done most of it, but we always leave 20%. It's always 80-20 rule always works. Yeah. So we did it for VDI. We got so far with VDI, and then we realized that not everything could be virtualized. We did the same thing for apps as well. That's the next bit. And if you remember back in the day, what we started doing is if you look at the app stacks, no pun intended, but if we get into here, we started looking at virtual apps.
Yeah.
Right? And when I say virtual apps, so we took the concept of an MSI, and if you think about it back in the day as well, there was other competitors in the market. There's a popular one that others use, but we used to use FinApp.
Yeah.
And I saw the same thing there as well. So we take an MSI, and we try to convert all our MSIs into FinApps. And we kind of reached the same thing. There was things like COM plus objects, shell extensions, kernel mode drivers and things, and we started going, okay, I can't convert everything. But why did we do that? Because we started saying, well, I can do really clever things with the image. The bit that's problematic is this other side with the applications.
Yeah.
So we've been, again, as an industry going, let's take everything we did and convert it. And every time now that I go to a customer and I talk about reformatting or repackaging applications, they look at me and like I'm the devil, right? Because there's a lot, the industry spent a lot of money doing this. And I'm not saying that FinApp did or didn't work, but I think what we've done is we're guilty as an industry of taking something that's good for a specific set of use cases and trying to do it and apply it as a vanilla thing across everything.
Yeah.
And all the things that don't really work, we sort of try to shoehorn in, right?
Yeah.
I think history's told us that it's not a single way of doing it. You need to embrace all, and you're never going to quite get rid of everything.
And those are the biggest challenges we faced with VDI in general. And it's still the biggest misconception, I would say, nowadays.
Yeah. So when you go to a customer and they say, my strategy is VDI, and I still see it a lot in finance. It's interesting because finance did a lot of work back in the day. They spent an inordinate amount of money trying to fix all these storage issues and everything. And if you look at some of their stacks, from an infrastructure perspective, they got lots of combinations of different stuff. I think Brian made a talked about this before, where you might have a bit of Citrix, you might have a bit of vSphere, you might have maybe AppSense or Avanti as it is now. You've got all of these like solutions on solutions on solutions to try and get to this real stack. And then we haven't even talked about non-persistent or persistent yet.
No, true.
Because everything up until this point, it's sort of like for like physical. But then, because we realized we could image everything and re-image it, we started getting into non-persistent, which is when FinApp and all of this stuff started becoming really important. But anyway, yeah, so first thing we used to do is we used to go into a customer and say, let's import your image. Okay, and then we'd spend quite a lot of time going, you don't need that bit of the image, you don't need that bit of the, remove that service, get rid of that. And actually, as you know, there's a fling that we all use. It's kind of industry, kind of, I guess, standard now.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most downloaded flings on the Fling website.
The optimizer, the OS optimizer tool. Yeah, and that's been developed throughout the years, but the main thing there was we couldn't use the same thing we did on physical in virtual.
No, true.
So we had to make some adaptations. And I think the same thing happened here. And back in the day, what I used to see, and we'll get back to this later on, is everybody would then use all their apps that were here, that were MSI, and they would say, well, I want to use SCCM or another management tool, maybe a LAN desk or whatever it is these days. I manage my physical desktops using that.
Yeah.
And if we're talking to the desktop guys, they want the same management tool. Remember what I was saying? Everybody wants this one way of doing things. They want to take everything they did here and use it inside there. So in the very early days of VDI, I spent most of my life telling people, you can do all this good stuff at the image level. And then they tell me, yeah, but we still want to deliver the apps using LANDesk or SCCM, and we still want to do all the profile management and everything else using traditional. So they use roaming profiles, which we know back in the day potentially.
Please read the section in my book about roaming profiles and find out for yourself. Roaming profiles suck, period.
I didn't say it, but he did, but that's kind of where I was alluding to. But yeah, anyway. So we got very good at saying, and you can already see what we're starting to get to this point now is, you need to make a bit of a choice.
Yeah.
Where you need to kind of optimize what you need to do for a VDI workload versus the physical workload. But because, like I say, there's been this, and let's be honest, it kind of comes back from ITIL and some of the original methodologies, where it said if you standardize your management tooling, you standardize your processes, you can get better cost of sale. And that's kind of what IT have been tasked with for the last 25 years. I'd even argue that when I go to customers today, they say they have a strategy around workplace. And actually, I kind of feel that there might not be the right people to have that strategy. Because they've been told, do what you do, but less money. But
so we also basically lower the TCO?
Yeah. Right. And that's what we've done with IT for a while. We've been going into customers saying how we can lower the cost. But at the same time, we need to give a better user experience. And the two don't necessarily work hand in hand. I mean, if you keep cutting costs, you need to invest at some point as well. And also, IT are very good, but they're really looking from IT's perspective. That's why they got very good at getting the management tooling and the application stuff. But they're not so good from a user experience perspective, in my opinion.
True.
So one of Spencer's top tips at the moment is if you're going to go down this route, I know we're talking specifically VDI, but I think you should really try and get other leaders from other parts of the business. HR is a good one. We're speaking a lot. Absolutely. To say what the user experience should look like. It shouldn't just be an IT-led thing.
Yeah, because the reason why this worked for a lot of years was because we treated the business as one single type of user.
Correct.
And put them inside a box. But that box nowadays doesn't exist anymore because I read my email probably more on my phone than I do on my MacBook, and sometimes remotely log on to a Windows session to do stuff. So the box doesn't exist anymore.
And again, I know you talked about this with Brian, but that concept of treating the user. So I often used to put slides up. I had goats. I nicked them from another Brian. And that's how we treated users. As an IT person, we think of users as all the same. I used to, I'll publicly say this by the way, I used to treat them as a bit of an annoyance.
Right.
Users used to get in the way of what IT were trying to do, but actually if you look at it, it's switched around. IT used to run the roost. We owned all the assets. We owned all of the compliance and all the regulatory stuff around it in terms of how we deliver everything. And now it's kind of sometimes the other way around. Yeah. I remember my very first day at work, I signed a document that said, you're going to sign your life away. You won't do this with the device. You won't do this. Yeah. And that's changed, I think. I know there's still a lot of companies that do that, but that
should be the other way around. Yeah. How can we enable users to get the most out of their working day? Yeah. And make them the most important ambassador within your IT infrastructure or your infrastructure in general? Yep. Yeah.
But a lot of what you say comes back to this, because we was in this nice world in IT where users were second class, if you like. IT ran the roost in terms of how they did this. Their primary focus was lowering costs, standardizing everything to the nth degree, locking it all down to the nth degree, and getting to the point where I was very happy on a Friday evening that I could go out for a beer because I had all of this in place. But as you know, things have turned round and it's all about the end user.
Absolutely.
But this bit here, this is where it all came from. And what I used to find back in the day is everybody was trying to borrow everything they did from the physical stack and port it directly into VDI world.
Yeah.
And if you look at all of these, and we won't go to the nth degree here, but all of the different solutions we've had, so maybe it's app volumes, FinApp, UEM, little UEM, big UEM, persona management. All of the tools that we built up throughout the years have all been focused on solving some of the, I need to do it slightly different in a virtual way.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly, having told everybody not to use a physical management tool to manage VDI for the last 12 years in my career, with the emergence of, we might as well talk about this now, I'm not going to go ultimately into every single component, but if you think about Workspace ONE UEM, actually, along with other components, the way that this will eventually go is you will see desktops as a component you manage with UEM, VDI as a component, and we're already starting to see that integration. And the reason why I say that now is you can actually enroll a Windows 10 VDI desktop directly into Workspace ONE UEM.
So you're starting to see some kind of convergence in the way you manage your physical and your virtual world.
Yes. Now, the challenge there, of course, is the first early days are persistent desktops.
Yeah.
Because they don't change and you can treat them. When it starts to become a bit more transient, which is what we were doing back in the day around image management and non-persistent desktops, it gets a bit harder. But we're starting to see some of the benefits. Because what that will give you, of course, then is if I go into the Workspace ONE console, I can start to see inventory data. Right? Now, why do I want to have that across a separate VDI stack versus physical? If I'm a security guy or I want to look at the latest patch level, that should be across the entire stack. I mean, we're not going to get into Mac and the rest yet, but if you look just on the Windows stack, that gives me a consistent operations from at least patching level and reporting level, even if I'm not using the same application delivery mechanisms. But hold that thought, because I think ultimately we should get to a point where you get to choose as an admin versus the users versus the business what is the best way of delivering. And we talked about this earlier. Maybe everybody gets a VDI desktop as a second desktop as a fallback. You get maybe a physical desktop or a phone as your everyday type device. And then what you now want is a single way of managing across all of those. You don't want multiple stacks. You want a consistent way. And I think that's what we're driving to. Yeah. The big bit is between virtual and the physical. But yeah, there's been a lot of history around how we've then got to subdividing all the application layers and the imaging layer as well.
Awesome. Well, Spencer, thanks for guiding us through, I would say, maybe the history of VDI.
Yep.
The future of VDI.
Yep.
Kind of-ish.
Well, so here's the interesting thing here. Like I said, we've been as an industry trying to get one tool to rule.
Yeah.
So I think, and this is Spencer, but I know this is what we're trying to do from VMware as well, is don't worry about what the way of delivering the workload is. What you really want is the management tool at the top end. Now, if the management tool allows you to abstract out what the choices are, and ultimately the user chooses the right way of delivering and what they need to do for their applications and how they get access, it shouldn't really matter. No. It should be that the user chooses, not IT. So I think, and the reason why that's been a problem in the past is the fact that our management tool was constraining the choices. Yeah. And I think that's the thing that's changing now is, if you think the future will be VDI is managed by this, physical is managed by this, Macs, iOS, Android, then it shouldn't matter, right? No. And then you have a consistent way of doing it, which means now that you don't have IT dictating what can and can't be used. There is a second angle to it, which we haven't got time to go into, I don't think, which is around security, which is probably a whole new section in its own right, because the two are kind of inextricably linked. There's a lot of security practices. But I think purely from an IT physical person, how they used to do something using physical desktops and all of this learning, I'm foreseeing that these two are going to come back together.
And especially, you mentioned earlier that when consuming those different services as subscription services, it makes it easy to scale up the number of desktops if you need to, or your devices, or the different flavors of managing your full digital workspace.
Well, you touched on something earlier which leads directly into that. We used to go through this process of treating all users the same. Then we did this massive thing, which I know you've written about as well, which is segmenting the users. Yeah. So user profiling, so that we can then say, well, this person's a call center person versus a sales person. Now, interestingly, I argue we've evolved beyond that as well, which is I could be a office worker during the day when I'm in the office, but when I'm at home, I'm a traveling worker. So we like to try and put one label on one person from an IT perspective, but I think we're going to get more clever around how we personalize. And to your point then, the reason we did that is because of the way we used to buy stuff.
Yeah.
And that was very often CapEx, upfront, infrastructure, which is why we got very good at designing the infrastructure stack. You need to buy the licenses up front. And a lot of the time I go to a customer and they say, I want 10,000. And you'd say, well, maybe I'll put 10,000 on after 3 years. But if you think about that, they're not realizing the value in between. And we got very good at helping customers accelerating their adoption so they could realize the full value. But to your point now, around subscription and the way that we change the way that you consume this, you could have a cloud service which is more burstable, on demand. So do you really care that if you plan for 10,000 but you never ever get there, if you're only paying for the amount of usage? Now, if you think about that, you get them really flexible. If you've got a management structure that allows you to deliver exactly what you want based on user requirements, and you're not constrained by the tooling, you're not constrained by the costs in the same way, you can get quite flexible about how you design and personalize the right experience for the end user. And I think that's definitely the model. And old constructs kind of limiting us, I think, are going out the window. And it's not just the IT side, but you're right, the licensing as well.
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. Thanks, Spencer, for explaining this all to us. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions about any of the solutions that Spencer just mentioned, or anything Workspace ONE in general, this is how to reach us. For now, thanks for watching and see you next time.
Thank you, Johan.